Over on Gator 8, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about a 2001 game between Oregon State and Montana State that got canceled at the last minute, and the bizarre controversy surrounding its cancellation. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. Franco Harris is an absolute legend in every sense of the word, and I think that goes without saying. I'd be here all day if I listed every single accolade that Harris received, and every single award that Harris won. Because without him, the history of the NFL and the trajectory of the Pittsburgh Steelers changes completely. He made it to 9 consecutive Pro Bowls from 1972 to 1980. He set the NFL record at the time for most seasons with 1,000 rushing yards, doing this 8 times. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. He won 4 Super Bowls, and was named the MVP of Super Bowl IX. He's a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a winner of the NFL Man of the Year Award, now known as the Walter Payton Man of the Year, and is a member of the All-1970 second team. And at one point, after the 1983 season, he was second all-time in rushing yards, only behind the legendary Jim Brown. He's a critical part of NFL history, and his death was especially shocking, considering that on December 24th, the Steelers were set to honor him on the 50th anniversary of arguably the greatest and most iconic play in NFL history, the Immaculate Reception, by making him just the 3rd player in Steelers history to have his jersey number retired. Obviously, the Immaculate Reception is the 1972 game that he's best known for, and it's not hard to see why. The play is one of the greatest and most iconic plays in NFL history for a reason. It had everything. High stakes being in a playoff game, a game-winning touchdown, an intense rivalry, a controversial rule. It's lived on in the great history of the sport for obvious reasons. But what you might not know is the game that Harris had 3 weeks before the Immaculate Reception. It's a game that has been lost throughout NFL history, but deserves to be remembered, and deserves to be a part of the great lore of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Because in a 1972 game against the division rival Cleveland Browns, Harris had what I like to call the beef broth game. In the first half of this game, Harris was struggling to get a whole lot of anything going. And in the second half, he was a one-man wrecking crew. And it was all because of a little bit of beef broth. It's one of the funniest and craziest halftime adjustments ever, and we're taking a deep dive into that today. Because this is the story behind what might just be the craziest game in the legendary Hall of Fame career of the great Franco Harris. Before I talk about the game itself, how well Harris played, and how beef broth of all things came into it, we need some context to understand why this game was so important in the first place, and why this game meant the world to the Steelers. It's December 3rd, 1972. It's Week 12 of the NFL season, and we have an absolutely critical game on our hands over at Three Rivers Stadium between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cleveland Browns. To say that this was a big game would be a massive understatement. In fact, it might have been the biggest game of the entire season. With just 3 weeks to go, both the Browns and the Steelers enter this game atop the AFC Central with identical 8-3 records. Now, barring anything crazy and a massive choke job the rest of the way, both the Steelers and the Browns look like they were firmly in the playoff picture, with the Steelers looking poised to make the playoffs for the first time since 1947, ending a 25-year drought. However, the division was still very much up for grabs, as the winner would jump to sole possession of first place with just 2 games to go. And especially back in 1972, that was huge, because whoever won the division would get home field advantage throughout the entire postseason. Seeding rules were a bit different back then, in that there was no seeding, and all of the home sites were predetermined. That's why the Dolphins, despite going undefeated, did not get to host the AFC Championship that year. It was a horrible and a pointless rule, but 1972 was the year of the Central according to the rotation, so whoever won the division would be in a great spot for the playoffs, while the wild card would not only have to go on the road, but would have to face an undefeated Miami team in the divisional round. Safe to say, there was a lot riding on this game, especially for the Steelers, who lost the first meeting to the Browns, meaning that they absolutely could not afford to lose this one due to losing the head-to-head tiebreakers. As a side note, if you want to learn more about the wacky world of playoff tiebreakers back in the early 70s, click the card in the upper right corner. If the Steelers were going to get revenge on the Browns and win this one, then they were going to need a good game out of this man right here, Franco Harris, their first-round pick out of Penn State. Now, fortunately for the Steelers, Harris had been just about the best running back in all of football around this time, as he was well on his way to winning the Offensive Rookie of the Year award and making it to the Pro Bowl. The Steelers were 4-1 over their last 5 games, and Harris had at least 100 yards rushing and 1 rushing touchdown in all of them, running for 637 yards on over 8.4 yards per carry and 6 rushing touchdowns. He was playing at such a high level for anyone, let alone a rookie. For some perspective on how well he was playing entering this game against the Browns, from weeks 7 through 11, he led the NFL with 8.4 yards per carry. Among players with more than 30 carries in that stretch, so greater than 6 carries per game, the next closest guy was Marv Hubbard of the Oakland Raiders, who had 6.1. Harris was a full 2 yards per carry better than the next best running back over that stretch. He was that good. He also led the NFL in rushing yards in that stretch by over 100 yards. Only 2 other players had over 500 yards, and only 4 other players besides those 2 had over 400 yards. And then there was Franco Harris, just towering over everyone with his dominance. There's a reason that some dubbed him the Italian Stallion, and that nickname was given for good reason. Long story short, Harris was playing lights out, and if the Steelers were going to get one step closer to the division title, they were going to need another great game out of Harris. However, in the first half, quite simply, that was not happening. Even though Harris punched it in from 1 yard out in the second quarter, keeping his consecutive games with a touchdown streak alive, the Browns were doing an incredible job containing him and holding him in check. It was a bit of a shock, to say the least, that Harris struggled so heavily in the first half, as he was held to just 26 yards rushing. That's especially true when you consider the fact that when the teams met 2 weeks before in Week 10, Harris had 136 rushing yards and averaged over 11.3 yards per carry while doing so. And when you consider the fact that Cleveland's run defense on the season was not very good, ending the season ranked as the 3rd worst team in the league in rushing yards allowed and the 5th worst team in the league in yards per carry. And yet, they came to play against Franco Harris this time. The good news for Pittsburgh was that they were leading at the halftime break by a score of 10-0. The bad news, however, was that they knew that this was not sustainable in the slightest bit if they could not get Franco Harris going and get the ground game moving in the right direction. And that's when a crazy adjustment was made at halftime. That adjustment? A little thing known as beef broth. Seriously, beef broth. Now, while it might seem unconventional to some, broth has been used throughout the history of football as a way to try and rejuvenate players. One of the best known instances of this came during this game right here, which was the 1979 Cotton Bowl between Houston and Notre Dame. With the Fighting Irish trailing 34-12 in the second half, quarterback Joe Montana decided to have some chicken soup. And after having the chicken soup, it was like he was a completely different player. Montana led Notre Dame on a scoring spree in the fourth quarter, as Notre Dame scored the final 23 points of the game to win it 35-34 with no time left. And today, you'll see some players having some broth or soup on the sidelines or in the locker room for a variety of reasons. Just like nowadays, it's common to see pickle juice being used to treat players and prevent cramping. Whereas before the pickle juice game, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, that was not the case. But back in 1972, that idea was somewhat insane and unconventional, especially for a player like Franco Harris, who, unlike Joe Montana in the Cotton Bowl years later, was not sick. Harris was perfectly healthy and was feeling good. He was just struggling to play well. And yet, at halftime of this game against the Browns, he decided to have some beef broth. That raises the question, why beef broth? I dug high and low, and couldn't find any other games that the Steelers used beef broth at halftime, nor could I find any other games that Franco Harris used this technique. Now that's not to say it hadn't been done before. Rutgers football was using broth as a sideline refresher in the late 1950s, so it's not like this came from completely out of nowhere. However, there are quite a few benefits to beef broth. It keeps you warm and gets your body temperature up, which is especially important on a day like this, where it's December in Pittsburgh, and under the old wind chill factor, it was just 28 degrees outside, due to 14-mile-per-hour winds. And it helps a ton with recovery, due to it being rich in protein, which is good when you're being tackled constantly in cold weather, making every collision feel like you've been hit with a truck. So that's exactly what Franco Harris did at halftime. The Steelers gave him some hot beef broth, which again, I could find no articles or evidence saying that they had ever done this before this game. And Harris was on his way just like that. As Harris said on drinking the broth at halftime, I guess I just get warmed up. I come in here and drink that hot broth, and I'm all ready to go. Which raises the question, did the broth make a difference at all? Did the strategy used by Franco Harris benefit himself and benefit the team? Well, judging by these highlights from the second half that you've been watching, I think you might know the answer to that question. Because when all was said and done, the Steelers won the game by a final score of 30-0, absolutely destroying the Browns offensively in the second half, and putting the game well out of reach. And the player that made it all possible with his great second half performance? You guessed it, none other than the man of the hour, Franco Harris himself. Because in the second half of the game, he had 76 yards rushing, plus a drive-changing 20-yard reception in the third quarter, and scored what felt like a dagger touchdown in the third quarter as well, when his 11-yard score put the Steelers up 17-0, in what seemed like an insurmountable lead with how well their defense had been playing. Most running backs get worse as the game goes on, but Harris somehow got better. It was as though the beef broth at halftime transformed him into a completely different player from what we saw in the first half. From 26 yards in the first 30 minutes to 76 yards in the final 30 minutes, increasing his output on roughly the same number of touches by nearly 200%. The second half outburst put him at over 100 yards on the day, as he not only finished the game with 102 yards rushing and over 5 yards per carry, keeping his hot streak alive, but it gave him his 6th straight game with over 100 yards rushing, which tied an NFL record held by Jim Brown for the most consecutive games with 100 yards rushing. Oh, and most importantly, it helped the Steelers jump to sole possession of first place in the AFC Central. With that game, considering the fact that they finished 11-3 and the Browns finished 10-4, being the difference in Pittsburgh winning the division and having home field, and being the wild card. Franco Harris was an absolutely unbelievable player throughout his entire career, and he had a ton of great moments, from the immaculate reception, to his MVP performance at Super Bowl IX, to his 3 first-half touchdowns in the 1974 divisional against the Buffalo Bills, to his incredible 71-yard touchdown run in their offensive shootout against the Browns in 1979, to his late fourth-quarter goal line touchdown at Super Bowl XIV that officially gave the Steelers their 4th title in franchise history. Seriously, there are too many great and iconic moments to recognize. And in all of that craziness and greatness, this game gets lost in the shuffle, despite it helping Pittsburgh win their first division title ever, and despite the bizarre halftime adjustment that worked wonders. In 2000, we had the pickle juice game with one Pennsylvania running back going up against a division rival. But nearly 30 years before that, we had the beef broth game. Just another iconic moment in what was nothing short of an iconic career. Rest in peace to an absolute legend. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.